Okay, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming to the Cross School Speaker Series. Today we have the pleasure of listening to Dr. Chris Gaffney. Before I introduce him, I'd like to introduce the series, which is a mechanism to bring together different talks that unite geography to all the other different schools and departments on campus. From the Rhodes School of Business, from International Studies, from the Geography Club, from a few other sources about international studies I mentioned already, and a couple other sources. Oh, anthropology, thank you. Thank you. It's really been a terrific event, a real opportunity to start interesting interdisciplinary conversations. And certainly our speaker, Chris Gaffney, will certainly do that. Chris is not only a expert academic, he's also a good friend of mine, someone I studied with, so it's been really neat to strategize to get him here right after the World Cup. He is the most interviewed and cited critic of the World Cup in Brazil throughout the whole process leading up to, during, and after. You'll see his picture in Sports Illustrated, you'll see him interviewed on ESPN, you'll see an HBO special with him on it, as well as you'll see him in the Wall Street Journal, Al Jazeera, etc. So it's a real honor to have him here. He's the author of the book Temples of the Earthbound Gods, the Stadiums and Cultural Landscapes of Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires. He's the author of numerous book chapters and academic articles, as well as also the author of the blog Hunting White Elephants, which now has over 200,000 hits. He continues to research mega events, not only the World Cup, but he's already looking forward to the Olympics in Rio in 2016, and he actually will be moving from his post in the Escola de Arquitetura e Urbanismo da Universidade Federal Fluminense in Niterói, Rio de Janeiro. He'll be moving to Zurich, Switzerland, right?
Yeah.
So that'll be an opportunity to learn about what's going on in Europe in regards to mega events and their social, economic, and cultural impacts. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Gaffney. Let's give him a warm round.
Thanks, David. Thank you, David, and thank you to the University of Richmond community for inviting me here. It's been a real pleasure to sit in on some of your classes, and I've already got a bunch of familiar faces here, so I'm feeling a little bit more at home than I would otherwise. The title of the talk is Rio's Naked Geography, which was a cheap ploy to get a bunch of undergrads in to look at bikinis. But what I really want to do with this is to think about how mega events, in particular the World Cup and Olympics in Rio de Janeiro, are clothing the city in a narrative of progress, development, sustainability, and to take that clothing off, to look at really what is going on in the city. And principally the narrative that I'm going to be looking at is one of impending disaster before the World Cup. We had a lot of protests in 2013 for the Confederations Cup, strikes, human rights violations. Everyone was talking about what a terrible event the World Cup was going to be, a lot of stress about the realization of the World Cup. Then the supposed success of the event, which resulted in the smooth handing off of the trophy from the president, Dilma Rousseff, to the German captain. And then looking ahead to the Olympics in 2016 to see what the impacts of these events on Rio de Janeiro has been, what it will be, and how these narratives are constructed. And of course, this is the product of more than 10 years of work. I've been living and researching in Rio de Janeiro full-time for the last 5.5 years, so every time I step out the door, I'm doing research. Every time I pay extra rent because I live in a World Heritage Site, I realize that this is not it's not a distant thing from my life. Just to localize you, maybe a few hundred years ago, when Brazil's borders weren't quite formed, but all these triangles are where the World Cup was held. In Brazil, 12 World Cup host cities, and Rio de Janeiro, of course, is not just Ipanema and Copacabana, but it's a metropolitan area of between 12 and 13.5 million people, depending on where you start or stop measuring. It's a massive place. It's a massive place that has no metropolitan planning. It has 30% sewage coverage. It has the worst air quality in Brazil. And according to one measure of police violence, Rio de Janeiro state police kill more citizens in confrontations than any other police force in the world. And so this is a city of great contradictions. And this is the naked geography that we're all used to, usually the glamour shots of Rio de Janeiro. And it is truly a beautiful place with a really rich and vibrant culture. And this is just the gratuitous geography of the city. This is the naked geography that we are used to seeing. The Pão de Açúcar, the green trees, the informal settlements next to the formal settlements. This is the complexities and contradictions of Rio, which of course I won't have time to get into in full detail, but just to situate you in the city. This is my previous work, which I started back in 2003, about the history and culture of football stadiums and using stadiums as lenses to read urban process, to read urban cultures. Because football is such an important cultural element of both Argentina and Brazil, of Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro, I used the stadiums as a lens to analyze the different cultural, political, economic, and social processes happening in those cities. And this work has continued with a slightly different focus during the World Cup. This is a picture I took from a subway stop in Sao Paulo. And it says, "Você é brasileiro de 4 em 4 anos," which means you're a Brazilian every 4 years, which means are you only a Brazilian when the national team is playing? And the mask here is a classic Tupi-Guarani war paint, or ceremonial paint. And so this is a mixture of Brazilian national identity with an ethnic identity, questioning whether or not it's really possible that Brazilian national identity can be consolidated every 4 years around the World Cup. And this was really one of the main questions plaguing Brazil in the years leading up to the World Cup. And the reason for this was because we had delays in construction, delays in not only stadiums, but the promised transportation, the legacy benefits, the sewerage benefits. All these things were hugely delayed, hugely overpriced, riddled with corruption. And of course, the protests that most of you saw on TV last year were a result of these frustrations built up over many years. It's also important to remember that the World Cup was just one in a long series of events that's coming to Rio de Janeiro. The role of mega events as vectors for urban development is well known. We saw this in increasingly in forms of appropriation of these events in places like Athens, Beijing, Vancouver, South Africa, Sochi, and now Brazil. Starting in 2007 with the Pan American Games, we then had the World Military Games realized in Rio. We had the Rio +20 Environmental Conference. We had the 2013 Confederations Cup. We had the Pope's visit. Then we have the World Cup. Then we have Rio's 450th anniversary in 2015, which will be a big celebration. And then the Olympics. And so the Olympics will be the culminating moment of 10 years of hosting these events. And the principal question that needs to be asked, and was asked on this graffiti, again in Sao Paulo. Here is the Sao Paulo Stadium, and this cost has since gone up to about 1 billion reais, or 500 million US dollars. Is Copa para quem? The World Cup for whom? For whom was this 30 billion real investment directed? Who are the winners and who are the losers of this process of hosting mega events? For the anthropologists, I include this element here. One of the interesting elements of being an academic and working in Brazil on these issues is that there is no separation between our roles as academics and as political activists. Nearly all of the academics I work with are directly involved in social movements, and we use our research to fortify social movements that are resisting the negative effects of these events. And I've written an article about my participation in this organization, which is called the Associação Nacional dos Torcedores, which was a football-based organization that I helped found with several other academics to use our position within the academy to militate for the democratic rights of football fans in Brazil. It was a short-lived affair, and we were fighting for these three principal elements. But to contextualize where I am situating myself in this and the way that many academics in Brazil, in a group of researchers that we have around the country in all 12 host cities, we used our research to fortify what are called the Comitê Popular da Copa. In Rio, it's the Copa e Olimpíada, the World Cup and the Olympics. But in all 12 World Cup cities, academics helped to form active resistance and to produce documents that were building a counter-discourse to that of the government and of FIFA. Of course, the academics worked with the syndicates, the labor movements, pre-existing social movements such as informal workers, sex workers, homeless people, NGOs that were involved in various aspects of urban governance, and particularly communities under threat of forced removal for projects associated with the World Cup. One of the things that we did is to produce, here it's called Mega Events and Violations of Human Rights in Rio de Janeiro. We produced 3 of these documents over 3 years, categorizing and cataloging all of the human rights violations that were being carried out, if not directly related, indirectly related to the process of hosting mega events in Brazil. And these have to do with forced evictions, arbitrary arrests, processes of gentrification, disappropriation of public lands for private projects, and the legal machinations that were required in order to host the events. And so in Brazil, in order to construct a legal framework for the World Cup, we had to pass a law at the national level called the Lei Geral da Copa, the general law of the World Cup, that allowed FIFA to import elements for the realization of the event. It gave tax exemptions. It provided a legal buffer that protected FIFA from all liability relative to the event. And so these were denounced in various ways. And then in a national framework, we were able to establish a general association of all the Comités Populares from each city. And so we had perhaps the largest mobilization in the history of these events resisting the World Cup. And on this website here, there are links to the publications that have these human rights denunciations. This was also combined with public action policies, such as No Vai Ter Direitos, We Will Not Have Rights, which used social media to bring people onto the street to question certain elements periodically of the World Cup and the Olympics. And this then resulted in a national scale document that makes the claim that more than 170,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes for the installation of transportation, security, stadium, and hotel projects directly associated with the hosting of the World Cup this year. How did this look on the streets? This was an organization, the Maraca é Nosso, the Maracanã, the most famous, perhaps one of the most famous stadiums in the world, if not the most famous stadium in the world, was undergoing massive architectural reforms, privatization at the cost of 1.2 billion reais of public money. A group of interested parties formed, people that were being directly impacted by this reform, to take the fights to the streets. And this is one of the ways that we would do this. I was very much involved in the planning, the operational aspects of this group, going onto the streets, blocking traffic, coordinating with the police to raise awareness. This is another public event. Keep the Maracanã in public hands, stop forced removals. World Cup for who? And this is, of course, associated with lefty political parties and such. But this is part of the work that a lot of people were engaging in the months and years leading up to the World Cup. Again, in front of the Maracanã, here's the entrance to the Maracanã here, bringing this awareness to the public week after week. In the years before even 2013, to keep these items alive in the public consciousness was a work, as we say, of ants. Everyone doing their little bit, everyone picking up the leaves and carrying them back to the queen bee. And then, of course, we had some great successes. This was the opening match of the Maracanã between Brazil and England, right in front of the media tribunal, or whatever you call it. People snuck this banner in and opened it up in front of the international media to draw attention to the fact that people are being forcibly removed in Rio de Janeiro for the World Cup. These are strategic elements of direct urban action that were very successful in raising awareness about the processes that were happening. And of course, this is a photo I took during one of the forced removals, which we'll see a little bit more later. Here on the right, we have an indigenous guy who's defending what was the old Museum of the Indian in Brazil, the Federal Museum of the Indian. And they formed, indigenous people occupied this building in 2006. It had been abandoned, and then were forcibly removed in 2013 and resisted the shock troops of the government for many, many months, but eventually were taken out and the building was reappropriated by the state government. But these are not light conflicts, as we'll see right here. I'll show you just a little bit of what this looked like and felt like on the ground if this video is going to load. May I come back to it? Come back to the video. It'll probably start exploding in just a second, so you'll get to see and feel what it sounded like. There we go. Don't go to Hobby Lobby. Sorry. All right, we'll just keep it here. And so this narrative developed starting in 2013 with the World Cup, with the Confederations Cup final, where 10,000 protesters met 10,000 riot police on the streets, where police were arbitrarily arresting people, tear gas, percussion grenades, rubber bullets, arbitrary arrests, dogs released on protesters. This was what was happening during the Confederations Cup, and FIFA almost canceled the Confederations Cup because of the social unrest. Following that, lots of protests, continuing protests about transportation, buses being burned, transportation workers going on strike, teachers going on strike, black bloc elements coming into the mix. And the narrative, the general narrative, was not only about Brazil being late in developing stadiums and developing architecture, but what was going to happen during the World Cup? Were there going to be millions of people on the streets? Were teams going to be blocked from getting to their training sites? And as you can see here, there's a lot of different groups involved in this. So the social movements, which I was part of, were also combining with the popular committees, labor movements. But then coming into our peaceful protests, our protests where we would inform police where we were going, what we were doing, black bloc elements would come in. And the black blocs are basically young kids with black hats and shirts and stuff that would just come in and start hitting the police because they're basically testing their macho-ness against the military police because they knew that the police didn't have live ammunition. The black bloc elements were not attacking police in the favelas because that's where they use live ammunition. And so there's a real difference between the urban tactics on the street and the urban tactics in the favelas. These groups were also potentially, and we know on many occasions, police, which are called P2, the secondary police, in a way, the hidden police, they would come and infiltrate the social movements, start the violence against the police to then justify the reaction. We saw police throwing Molotov cocktails at police to justify a really violent action against them. And then anarchists, right-wing elements, people that are against the PT government coming to try to destabilize a situation in order to throw this back in the government's face. There was also a lot of competition between police forces. The federal police didn't want to collaborate with the local police or the state police. And then all of this together with the costs and the Brazilian team not really coming together very well and the general ambivalence resulted in Brazilians saying, yeah, I'm not so sure I really want the World Cup. We paid for it, but I'm not too excited about it. Polls just on the eve of the World Cup suggested that 65% of Brazilians, remember, this is not Canadians or Finns or Taiwanese, Brazilians, 65% against the hosting of the World Cup. So how do you convince Brazilians to love the World Cup. And so we have this movement that was initially, the Brazilian government here, this was their initial propaganda for the World Cup. A pátria de chuteiras, the country of football boots. And so Brazilians refer to themselves as the country of football. And this is the country of football boots. And this was something that was also used by the military dictatorship in the 1970s, the same phrase. But on the eve of the World Cup, when 65% say they're against the World Cup, you can't say that it's the pátria de chuteiras. But you can say, pessimists, think again. And this is Ronaldo Fenomeno with the Uncle Sam hat, saying, think again, this is actually going to be okay. And then they move from the pátria de chuteiras to the cup of cups. This is going to be the best World Cup ever. And so you go from a sense of inclusion, of we're all kind of in this together, to having one of spectacle. And so enjoy the party. And this was a deliberate movement on the part of the government in order to try to get the Brazilian people on board. But everything went so well. Everybody enjoyed the World Cup. It was a great party. All the teams were on time. The stadiums were okay. They might have didn't function perfectly. Transportation seemed to be fine. No one complained about not getting from city to city. What's the problem? And I was having a debate with the ambassador, the Brazilian ambassador to Spain, that said he had no troubles moving around the country during the World Cup. Everything worked fine. The airports were still under construction, but that's going to be a legacy. But what really happened is that you had to have 64 holidays in a month. Every game day was a holiday. And so Rio de Janeiro, the city proper of Rio de Janeiro, has 6.1 million people. The Maracanã held 75,000 people for one match, say France-Ecuador. The entire city was on holiday so that people could get to the stadium and go away. The entire country of Brazil, 200 million people, 205 million people, did not have school during the World Cup. No school. And so if you have a holiday, if you keep kids at home, you keep parents at home. If you keep kids and parents at home, you keep them off the streets. And so the streets were emptied of Brazilians so they could be filled by others. And so it was very easy to move around. This also resulted in 15% less airline travel because people weren't going to do business around the country. And so the airports, whoa, hey, maravilha, it's functioning really well because there weren't as many people as even a normal month, as the same month a year before. And then, boom, 170,000 police on duty for the World Cup and 25,000 for the final alone. This also kept people off the streets. And I'll show you what they look like in just a second. The final element about why the World Cup was such a great success is that Brazilians are incredibly hospitable people. And I talked to many taxi drivers, many bus drivers, many people who would ordinarily be out on the streets protesting and said, well, you're not going to invite someone to your house and start talking about all your family problems. And so this kind of narrative that we need to be good hosts, we need to really receive people well, dominated Brazilian consciousness. And of course, the World Cup itself is a great party. You're going to have one World Cup in your lifetime in your home country, so you might as well just party. You've already paid for it. You're off school. You're off work. Kids at home. Where's the beer? Give me a... Right? And this was a great opportunity for Brazilians to meet people from Latin America as well. The Argentines were fantastic fans. Fantastic. They came en masse to Brazil, camped out on the beach in Copacabana, had a great party. Chileans. Most Brazilians hadn't met Chileans. Most Brazilians hadn't met Colombians. Most Brazilians hadn't partied with Mexicans, with Americans, with Dutch. Of course, they paid for it a little later. But the party was really great. And one of the things that Brazilians really know how to do is put on a world-class party at the last second, and everybody has a good time. It was that was fantastic. But again, what kept people off the streets? This is from the front page of Brazil's leading newspaper. Basically saying, this is what's coming at you during the World Cup, times 170,000 if you go out on the streets and protest. And it did. The first protests in Sao Paulo were met with extreme violence. The subsequent protests in Rio that I went to were also met with extreme violence. A good friend of mine was put in the hospital by police, having whacked him in the head with batons, kicked him in the face, ripped the GoPro camera off his head, and put him in the hospital. And so this was the climate around. So you're either into the party or you're not. And these guys are clearly having a good time. But these sort of training sessions were in the paper all the time, front page of the paper. This is what we're preparing for. We're preparing for terrorism. We've armed the police to the teeth. And the new laws regarding terrorism, we're considering including social movements and social actions as terrorist acts during mega events. Then finally, to make this operational, this is a photo I took from the Rio Operations Center. This is what you do around the stadiums to make it happen. You close everything down. And so not only do you suspend urban normalcy for 200 million people, around the game days, you radically control movements in urban space. But there were disasters. The narrative didn't talk about this at all. This was an overpass built for the World Cup in Belo Horizonte, one of the host cities. None of you probably saw any of these pictures or heard about this overpass collapse where somehow only 2 people were killed. But the ball is rolling. No one wants to talk about it, but this is a major fail. Of course, the Brazilian fail was on the field. So the narrative of Brazil not being able to produce infrastructure, stadiums, etc., but that they were going to win the World Cup and that was going to justify everything, just was flipped on its head. So Brazil was able to deliver a good tournament, but had a really crap football team, even though they made it to the semifinal, 7-1. Humiliation, the worst defeat in history, embarrassment, humiliation, a day to forget. So it's the World Cup. What happened to the spaces and places in which football is played? This is the Maracanã in 1997. As you can see, I was talking about with the class earlier today, you can see these open spaces here, relatively undifferentiated seating here, a really elegant roof structure with a view of the city and the mountains beyond. A capacity of 179,000 people, the biggest stadium since the Roman Circus 2,000 years ago, built in 1950 for the World Cup final. What's happened to that stadium? Since 2005, there have been more than 1.6 billion reais of public investment, about $800 million of public investment in this stadium. The stadium has been privatized. It was handed over to the same company that was in charge of the reforms that has very nefarious links to the governor and the mayor. Brazil's wealthiest man owns 5% of this contract. Fans have been expelled from the stadium. Brazil now has the world's most expensive football tickets relative to minimum wage. The stadium itself has been deformed on the inside. Some people call it a reform, I call it a deform, because the architecture sends messages. If the old stadium sent messages of inclusion and the trope of racial democracy in Brazil, the circular architecture, the undifferentiated seating, this stadium sends messages of exclusivity, festa, spectacularization. It's a studio. It's not a place where people go to create culture. It's a place where they go to receive it. And this has changed radically. And now instead of a 179,000 seat stadium, we have a 75,000 seat stadium. So we've reduced it by more than 100,000 people. It's been privatized for 35 years. And over the length of that concession, the state will only receive back 18% of the initial costs. And of course, with the Olympics coming, we'll need even more reforms. And this happened in Brazil as a whole. In 2007, the federal government said they would not spend 1 cent of public money on World Cup stadiums. That quickly changed. You can see the change here. 9.338 billion reais on football stadiums. Okay, that might not mean a lot because reais are reais. But what does that mean relative to other tournaments? The only way you can really measure costs of stadiums is the price per seat. And so you take the total construction cost, divide it by the number of people that can actually go to a game, and you get the price per seat. Brazil has 7 of the 10 most expensive stadiums in the world by this measure. More expensive than Germany, more expensive than South Africa, more expensive than Korea and Japan. And these numbers are still increasing. We're not exactly sure. what they cost. And as a measure of transparency, the Brazilian government put together 4 transparency sites to measure costs for the World Cup. The stadiums, none of those sites have the same numbers for capacity of the stadiums or for how much they cost. And so there may be even too much transparency because no one knows exactly what they're costing. Okay, I paint a really negative picture. I had a great time at the World Cup, to tell you the truth. Fun partying with the Argentines, fun partying with people on the beach, going to the games, great football, etc. So it wasn't all bad. There was, spend 30 billion reais, someone's going to get a job. All right, but most of that money, of course, goes to the top. There was some necessary infrastructure built, communications above all, a lot of investment in airports, which is desperately needed, and no major disasters. We had the collapse, the one collapse. A lot of people got shot, a lot of people went to jail unnecessarily. But 7-1 really hurts Brazilians. That hurt bad. People can't talk about it. People really can't talk about it. Especially when you are the country of football and you get handed 7 bratwursts. What do you do with 7 bratwursts? Then you're forced to eat them, and it takes a long time to digest. So this will take many years for Brazilians to get through. And interesting, we're less than 2 weeks away from presidential election. No one has said a word about the World Cup. The PT, the ruling party, the Workers' Party, hasn't mentioned the World Cup once. They haven't said we delivered a great World Cup. No one is talking about it. And so this was clearly some kind of national trauma. The opportunity costs of 30 billion reais are great. I was at a panel recently where someone said, oh yes, but if you think about 30 billion reais relative to the Brazilian GDP, it's not actually all that much money, so what are you complaining about? Okay, that's one way to look at it, but in the local context, it's not like that money just floats around. That money is being invested in local places that has impacts on local people. And one of the main factors of this is debt. Cities were allowed to violate the law of fiscal responsibility in Brazil in order to deficit spend for infrastructure projects. These projects will be paid for by future generations, and many of them have not been completed. And we also have, within this, a state of exception, which is kind of a big concept that everybody likes to throw around that comes from Agamben. But when you create exceptional laws, exceptional rules, exceptional circumstances for a mega event, for an entire month, or 2 months, or 3 months, and you repeatedly do that, nothing else is normal. There is no normalcy in Rio de Janeiro anymore because we're constantly in a state of exception. And so the rule of law does not apply. And on the heels of this, we're now less than 2 years away from the 2016 Olympics, and I'll turn to that right now. These rings, which you can sort of see here, and I explained this in a couple of classes, are the Olympic development zones for the 2016 Olympics. And we can see 3 transportation lines coming into the nominal Barra da Tijuca zone, 1 or 2 coming into Deodoro, and then this is the Copacabana, this is Ipanema here, Copacabana, center of town, etc. Through our work in the Comité Popular, we know that there will be at least 30,000 forest removals for these transportation projects. And what does this look like? And these photos are mine. This is what a forest removal looks like. Here in the back, we can see the approach of the closed condominiums. So as if the road is bringing development, quote unquote, towards and over this favela. We can see the tenuous connection between the formal city, or the informal city, and the formal city. And this man's house, his name is Jorge, he resisted this removal. And they bulldozed all the houses around him and left him there in this stagnant water for months until he finally caved to the pressure and desperation of living alone in this landscape. The justification for this removal was that one of those transportation lines would need to pass through it. That never happened, and today this is a weed patch. This is another forest removal on in the north zone of Rio that I visited on some of my interviews. And the pattern is clear. The government will come in, they'll negotiate, someone will take money, the neighbor won't, in order to encourage the other neighbors to move, they will simply demolish the house and leave the rubble there. These become havens for crack addicts who come in and try to pick through the rubble to get the metals. And so it becomes an extremely unsafe situation. And that's what happened in this area, as well as in this area. The Favela do Metrô, which is a couple goal kicks away from the Maracanã. And this little girl is taking drinking water out of a hole busted in her neighbor's wall. So that's the face of removals. Where are these removals principally happening? And so this part of town is the wealthiest part of town, Copacabana, Ipanema. This is the concentration of wealth in Rio is here as well as in this area. The purple houses represent favelas that have been removed. There's clearly a tendency as to where they're going. This part of Rio has the highest human development index. This has the lowest. 60% of Rio's jobs are concentrated here. 5% of Rio jobs are concentrated here. And so this is clearly a peripheralization of the poor in Rio de Janeiro. But where are they going? They're going to these housing settlements called Minha Casa Minha Vida. And some of you who study Brazilian urbanism may have heard of this. Minha Casa Minha Vida is a government-sponsored program that allows contractors to build low-income housing relatively cheaply for various ranges of income. In the West Zone, and this picture is taken from a recent newspaper, the West Zone of Rio is controlled by what we call militias. They're off-duty cops, firemen, civil servants, where that control the area. The police don't go in there because they are the police. Gangs, militias. And so many of these people that were removed to the West Zones, in order to take possession of their government-financed houses, had to pay up to 40,000 reais to the militias in order to live in those houses. And those who denounced the militias were tortured and left in public squares so that others would not. And so this is really problematic, a really problematic situation in Rio de Janeiro. The security situation in the west of the city is quite dire. And this is one of these where enough denunciations were made that the police went in and retook possession of government territory. Right, and so here's another clearer look about the security situation in Rio. And so what we see again are the Olympic development zones, the transportation lines, and these red dots are what are called pacification units, police pacification units. And a police pacification unit is, well, it looks like this. BOPE, which is Brazil's, Rio's elite shock troops, the SWAT team of Rio, will go into a favela, and this is their non-ironic logo. And this is they're the subject of the elite troop movies, if any of you have seen those. They will warn through the media that they're going to go into favela a couple weeks before. The drug traffickers will flee with their drugs and their guns, and BOPE will go in and occupy the favela, raising the Brazilian and Rio state flags on top of the hill, literally claiming land for the state. Then you have specially trained, lightly armed, these are small guns for Rio, that go in with tanks and such to pacify the favela. And in some instances, the Brazilian military has come in into some of the larger favela complexes. This is the Maré favela complex, which is on the main highway between downtown and the international airport. And they sit there and provide security. But what does that security mean? How does that take shape? It looks like a counterinsurgency. It feels like a counterinsurgency. And of course, security means different things to different people. And so it's a whole complex relationship, and I just want to go back to this a bit to show you again where this is happening. This is the Maracanã Stadium, a ring around the Maracanã Stadium, rings around the tourist areas, along key infrastructure, another Olympic area, and there will be another couple of UPPs out here by the time the Olympics happen. So this is clearly related to real estate protection, infrastructure protection for the Olympic Games. And the general effects of this are these. We've seen a lot of gentrification, especially in the favelas in the Zona Sul, the wealthy part of Rio, that have great views, access to beach, access to access to labor markets, speculation. And we've seen a decrease in homicides, but an increase in disappearances. And so people are categorizing differently how people disappear or die. We've seen petty crime increase because in favelas formerly controlled by drug traffickers, 10 to 15% of young men were active in the drug trade, and they lost their employment. They're not going to go flip burgers and such. And so this is what some of the collateral effects of UPP has been. And this is related, of course, to a larger ideology of what the city is supposed to be. This is a monopoly game that the city government developed to distribute to elementary school kids, right? And so you commodify urban life. And so these are the parts that can be bought and sold. And this is one of the luck cards that you get. So it says, your home increased in value after the neighboring community was pacified. And so this is clearly tying this ideological desire of commodifying urban space using the security apparatus for capital accumulation associated with the Olympic Games. It kind of gives me the shivers just looking at that. All right, so generally, what are these events bringing and how? I think I've answered a few of these questions already. We know it's urban economic and social restructuring. We know that the sustainability discourse is strong in this, in the literature used by FIFA, IOC, the city government. And to my mind, it's turning the city into a neoliberal laboratory. We're testing out urban policies that then could be picked up and moved to another place. So many of the policies used for Rio's security during the World Cup came from South Africa. They were adjusted, fitted to Rio, and now they'll be picked up again and moved on to Russia. So these are highly mobile policies. And this is what it's starting to look like. This is the Olympic Park. This is happening right now in a favela just next to the Olympic Park. And so we're removing people in order to create these landscapes of desire. The Olympic movement as the propulsionary element of a utopian landscape results in others, for others in a dystopia. And of course, this is the Olympic Village. What kind of urbanism is this? Is this a sustainable urbanism? This is a car-dependent, closed condominium, isolating landscape in a wetland environment. That is driven with a 2.33 billion real federal subsidy. And so the companies that are building this receive 2.3 billion from the government to build this, and then they'll sell these on the open market to the highest bidder. So it's guaranteed profits for private industry on land appropriated from the state. Again, I talked with a class the other day about this, about the Olympic golf course. For the first time in more than 100 years, golf is going to be in the Olympics. I wrote about this in this article here in the Sustainability Journal about the legal measures that were needed to disappropriate an environmentally protected land in order to build high-rise residential landscapes in a wetland area and a golf course, which is clearly not going to be sustainable. Okay, so wrapping up. Mega events. And we've had a lot of these. Remember, this is by the time we get to the Olympics, it'll be a decade of mega events in Rio. They are vehicles. They're not things, and they help to install regimes of exception to carry off large-scale urban projects that promote accumulation of capital in all its ways. Political capital, finance capital, promote human capital as well. But in doing so, it consolidates power. The institutions are fortified. And we see the militarization of urban space, whether it's London, Vancouver, Athens, Beijing, Russia, Sochi, Rio, Atlanta. We see this in the American cities, right? We see the criminalization of poverty and informality. You can no longer just go up to the Maracanã and get a beer from a vendor, someone that brought their cooler, because it's illegal now. So we've criminalized informality. We've expelled people from the streets. And the commodification of culture. We've used Brazilian football culture to package and sell something to then be consumed by a global audience. At the same time, expelling that culture from the place in which it was realized. Right? So the new stadiums as sites of spectacularized consumption are no longer sites where the fans can go and create the spectacle themselves. It's not the World Cup's fault. It's not your fault for liking the World Cup. It's not my fault for buying a ticket to the World Cup. But the World Cup accelerated existing trends, as will the Olympics. And one of the worst parts about this is the consolidation of the Brazilian military police model. And they have complete impunity. One police that was recently accused of shooting a rubber bullet into a crowd was acquitted because it was the fault of the person standing there. They lost their eye from a rubber bullet, and it was their fault for being in the way of the bullet. This is the kind of impunity that happens. We've seen the privatization of public space, not just the Maracanã, but the entire beach of Copacabana was privatized for the World Cup, temporarily, but used as a mechanism for accumulation. We've seen deficit spending, tax exemptions, and a depoliticization of the spectacle. We're not encouraged to think about the World Cup or the Olympics as political acts. Our spectatorship is depoliticized. Our role in the event is depoliticized, and we need to take that back. We need to engage these events as political moments, because they are. They can't not be. And of course, this is not just Rio, it's not just Brazil, but this is a highly mobile apparatus that moves around every 2 years. We'll be watching the Euros, we'll be watching the Women's World Cup, we'll be watching the Olympics, the Summer Olympics, the Pan American Games, the Universidade. These things happen all the time, everywhere, and they're highly mobile. And in Rio, we have a really long history of social protest, of social movements. And the consolidation of these events around already existing tensions ensure that we will continue to have protests. We will continue to have resistance to these events as we run 2 years to the Olympic Games. That's it. Thanks. I've got a few minutes for questions, I think. Yep.
10 minutes for questions.
Yes, please.
Well, I realize Richmond's not Rio, but have you been following the Chaco Bottom Stadium debate?
I haven't been following it, but I can probably tell you how it's going. I imagine that there's perhaps a proposed referendum that there are stadium boosters and business agents interested in. The media is probably right behind it, and that the...
There's no referendum. They don't want to decide that.
I'm sorry?
There's actually a push to have a referendum, but they're blocking it.
Because people will say no.
Voters will vote against it.
Well, and the thing about referendums is that it's a zero-sum game, right? And so people are talking about how do we ensure that countries or cities will want to host the Olympics or the World Cup? We'll have a referendum. Okay, 50 plus 1, you got the Olympics.